The sun hung lazily in the afternoon sky, casting long golden beams through the towering oaks that framed the Lawson family's backyard. It was a kind of day that made everything feel weightless, from the rustling leaves to the distant hum of cicadas. Emily, no more than 3 years old, toddled through the grass, her tiny hands reaching for the floating dandelion seeds drifting past her. Her laughter, high and bubbling, filled the space like a melody. A few feet away, Max watched her intently, his deep brown eyes tracking her every move. Max was no ordinary German shepherd. He carried himself with a quiet confidence, his movements precise, his instincts sharp. Ever since the Lawsons had adopted him 2 years ago from shelter, he had been more than just a pet. He was a guardian, an ever-watchful sentinel over their small family. Sarah often joked that Max treated Emily like she was his own pup, never straying far from her side, always standing between her and anything that seemed even remotely threatening. Today was no different. Tom sat on the porch, flipping to the pages of a worn-out book, occasionally glancing up to check on his daughter. Sarah was inside, finishing up lunch preparations, her voice carrying through the open window as she hummed softly. It was a moment of perfect peace, one of those fleeting instances of family life that felt frozen in time, as if nothing could ever disturb it. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Max's ears snapped forward, his body tensed, muscles coiling beneath his thick coat. His nose flared, sucking in air as if trying to catch an unseen scent. Something was wrong. Emily, oblivious, had wandered toward the edge of the yard where the grass grew wild and unkempt. A patch of dandelions had caught her eye, and she crouched down, chubby fingers grasping at the feathery white tufts. But just beyond her reach, half hidden in the tall grass, something moved. A ripple in the earth, too smooth, too controlled, sent a shiver of awareness through Max's body. He sprang into motion. Tom barely had time to register the blur of black and tan for streaking across the yard before Max lunged forward, a guttural snarl ripping from his throat. Emily squealed in surprise as the dog's powerful frame crashed into her, knocking her tiny body to the ground just as something lashed out from the grass. A sound, sharp and dry, split the air, the unmistakable warning of a rattlesnake. Tom was on his feet before he even knew what he was doing. "Emily!" he shouted, his heart slamming against his ribs as he bolted forward. Max had the snake in his jaws, his teeth clamped around the writhing body, shaking it with violent force. The rattler twisted, fangs flashing in the sunlight, striking wildly. Max flung the serpent to the ground, stepping between it and Emily, his lips peeled back in a vicious snarl. The snake coiled again, ready to strike. Tom skidded to a stop, scooping Emily into his arms as Sarah's scream echoed from the house. "Max!" The dog lunged a second time. His jaws snapped shut around the snake's head, silencing its rattle in an instant. The fight was over. The limp body dropped to the ground, unmoving. For a moment, everything was still. Tom clutched Emily against his chest, his own breath ragged, his mind struggling to catch up with what had just happened. Max stood over the snake's remains, panting heavily, his tongue lolling from his mouth. Sarah ran to them, her hands trembling as she checked Emily from head to toe. "She's okay," Sarah whispered in disbelief, pressing her daughter against her. "She's okay." Then Tom saw it. Max swayed on his feet, his powerful legs trembling. His ears drooped, his breathing heavy and uneven. Something dark glistened on his fur near his front leg. Blood. Tom dropped to his knees beside him, his fingers brushing over the wound. Twin puncture marks stood out against the thick coat. His stomach lurched. "Oh, God," he got bitten. Max whined softly, his body slumping against Tom's side. Sarah's voice sharpened. "We need to get him to the vet. Now." Tom didn't hesitate. He scooped Max into his arms, grunting under the weight of the large dog, and sprinted toward the car. Sarah was already yanking open the passenger door as Tom laid Max across the seat. The dog let out a low, weary whimper, his head lolling against Tom's arm. His breathing was coming in shallow, uneven bursts. Tom slammed the door shut and jumped behind the wheel, his fingers fumbling with the keys. The tires kicked up gravel as they tore out of the driveway, heading toward the vet's office on the other side of town. Sarah clutched Emily in the back seat, whispering soft reassurances even as tears streaked down her face. Tom gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The seconds stretched unbearably, each one a countdown against time. Max had saved Emily's life. But now he was slipping away. The fluorescent lights in the veterinary clinic buzzed faintly, casting a sterile glow over the cramped exam room. Max lay on the metal table, his chest rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. Tom and Sarah hovered nearby. Emily curled up in her mother's arms, her tiny fingers clutching Sarah's shirt as if afraid to let go. The sharp scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the coppery tang of blood. Dr. Collins moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen too much, and yet never allowed herself to become numb to it. Her hands, steady but urgent, worked quickly as she cleaned the wound. She murmured something under her breath, eyes narrowing as she inspected the deep puncture marks on Max's leg. "The anti-venom is already working," she said, glancing up at Tom and Sarah. "We got to him in time. He's lucky." Relief rushed through Tom so fast it made him lightheaded. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands bracing against his knees. Sarah's shoulders sagged as she pressed a kiss to Emily's forehead, but Dr. Collins hesitated. She ran her fingers over Max's leg again, her touch more searching now. "There's something strange here." Tom's heart lurched back into his throat. "What do you mean?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pressed her fingers a little harder along Max's ribs, then paused when she felt something just beneath the surface. A small, firm mass, no larger than a coin, lodged deep under the skin. Her brow furrowed. "That's not normal." Sarah stepped closer. "What's wrong with him?" Dr. Collins didn't respond. She reached for the x-ray machine, her movements brisk but controlled, and positioned it over Max's side. The machine hummed softly, filling the tense silence. Tom reached for Sarah's hand, gripping it tightly. Max had already been through enough. He had nearly died protecting their daughter. Whatever was happening now felt like an aftershock of the nightmare they had just escaped, and he wasn't sure how much more he could take. The X-ray images appeared on the screen, and Dr. Collins inhaled sharply. "What the hell?" Tom and Sarah turned to look. There, outlined against Max's ribcage, was something that had no business being inside him. A small metallic object, perfectly round, embedded deep within his tissue. It was too deliberate, too precise to be an accident. Sarah took a step back, her breath hitching. "What is that?" Dr. Collins shook her head. "I don't know, but it shouldn't be there." Tom swallowed hard. Could it be a microchip? She tapped the screen. Zooming in, microchips are tiny. This is much larger. "And look here." She pointed to a faint line running across the object center. "It looks like it opens." Sarah's skin prickled. "Opens?" Dr. Collins straightened. "We need to remove it." Max let out a low whimper, as if he understood the urgency in their voices. Dr. Collins moved quickly, preparing for a minor surgical extraction. Tom and Sarah exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. There was no other option. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the procedure began. Max lay still under anesthesia, his breathing steady but unnervingly shallow. Dr. Collins worked carefully, her scalpel moving with precise control. The metallic object came into view, slick with blood, its surface reflecting the harsh overhead lights. When she finally pried it free, the room fell into silence. Tom leaned forward. It was no bigger than a silver dollar, perfectly smooth except for the thin seam running around its circumference. Dr. Collins placed it on a sterile tray and wiped it clean, revealing an engraving so faint it was almost invisible. A set of numbers. And beneath them, a name. Daniel Marks. Sarah's mouth went dry. Who is that?" Dr. Collins shook her head slowly. "I don't know." Tom rubbed his face, his pulse pounding. None of this made sense. A hidden object inside their dog? A name etched onto it like some kind of message? How long had it been there? And more importantly, why? Sarah reached out, hesitating before her fingers brushed the cool metal. "We need to open it." Dr. Collins grabbed a pair of tweezers and carefully applied pressure to the seam. With a soft click, the capsule split apart. Inside, folded so tightly it had barely any thickness, was a slip of paper. yellowed at the edges, brittle but intact. Dr. Collins unfolded it, and they all leaned in. A single address. Tom felt an ice-cold chill settle in his gut. Sarah looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. What did Max just lead us to? The highway stretched endlessly before them, a dark ribbon cutting through the dense forest, its edges blurred by the creeping mist that had settled with the setting sun. Tom's hands gripped the wheel tightly, knuckles pale, his mind racing faster than the speedometer. Sarah sat beside him, silent, her eyes locked on the scrap of paper in her hands. The address was scrawled in neat, deliberate strokes, as if the writer had known it might be their last chance to be heard. In the back seat, Emily slept, her tiny fingers curled into the fabric of her blanket. Max lay beside her, still groggy from the anesthesia, but awake, his ears twitching at the occasional sound of tires against gravel. Despite the exhaustion pulling at his frame, his eyes remained watchful, fixed on the horizon. They had debated calling the police. Every logical part Tom had screamed that this wasn't their mystery to solve, that they should hand it over to someone trained to deal with things like this. But something about it felt personal now, as if Max had been carrying this secret for years, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. He had led them to this, and they owed it to him to see it through. As they neared their destination, the road narrowed, winding through thick clusters of trees that swallowed the last traces of daylight. The town itself was small, barely more than a collection of old houses and abandoned storefronts. The address led them to the outskirts, where a single, weather-worn house stood beneath the shadow of a dying oak. Tom killed the engine, and silence rushed in, thick and heavy. Sarah shifted uneasily. "What if this is a mistake?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tom exhaled slowly. "Then we leave." They stepped out cautiously, gravel crunching underfoot. Max followed, his movements slow but steady, his body tense with unspoken anticipation. As they approached the front porch, the house loomed over them, its paint peeling in long, curling strips, the windows dark like watching eyes. Tom knocked once. The sound echoed. For a long moment, nothing, then the faint creak of floorboards. A shadow moved behind the door. When it opened, the man standing there looked as if he'd been living in the past, a ghost left behind in time. His hair was streaked with gray, his face lined with exhaustion, but his eyes, sharp, wary, flicked immediately to Max. Tom cleared his throat. "Are you Daniel Marks?" A long pause. The man's gaze lingered on the dog. Then, finally, he nodded. "Who are you?" Sarah stepped forward, holding up the capsule. "We found this inside our dog. It had your name on it." Something in Daniel's expression cracked, a flicker of recognition, followed by something deeper, something close to grief. His hands trembled as he reached for the object, turning it over in his palm like a relic from another life. "You don't know what you've just uncovered," he murmured. Tom tensed. "Then maybe you should tell us." Daniel hesitated, then pushed the door open wider. "Come inside." The house smelled of dust and old paper, the air thick with the scent of memories long buried. Stacks of books and newspapers cluttered every surface, as if time had stood still here, preserving fragments of a story left unfinished. Daniel sank into an armchair, his fingers tracing the capsule absently. His gaze drifted back to Max. "You said he's your dog?" Tom nodded. "We adopted him a couple of years ago from a shelter. No history, no records. Just showed up one day." A slow breath. Then softly, "That's not your dog." The words landed like a thunderclap. Tom felt Sarah stiffen beside him. "What do you mean?" Daniel's fingers tightened around the capsule. "His name isn't Max. It's Rex. And 5 years ago, he disappeared the same night I did." A chill rippled down Tom's spine. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low and measured. "I was a researcher, worked on classified projects, things that weren't supposed to exist. When I realized what we were creating, I tried to stop it. They didn't like that." He exhaled sharply. "They came for me, but before they did, I left a message, a single clue, and I hid it in the only place I knew they wouldn't think to look." Tom swallowed. "Inside your dog." Daniel nodded. "I trained Rex myself. He was more than just a pet. He was a fail-safe, a way to make sure the truth survived, even if I didn't. Sarah glanced at Max, who sat quietly at her feet, his head tilted slightly, as if he, too, was waiting for the pieces to fall into place. Tom's mind reeled. If he was with you that night, how did he end up in a shelter states away? Daniel's jaw tightened. I don't know. I thought he was dead. His voice faltered. I thought I was the only one left. Silence settled over the room. The weight of what they had uncovered pressed down on them. A story unraveling from the shadows, stretching back years. Finally, Daniel looked up, his gaze landing on Max. His lips parted, voice raw. Rex. For a moment, nothing. Then, slowly, Max rose to his feet. His ears pricked forward. His body went still, the way it did when he was listening, really listening. And then, as if something long buried had stirred awake, his tail gave a single, slow wag. Daniel let out a breath that sounded dangerously close to a sob. Tom exchanged a glance with Sarah, his pulse hammering. Whatever had happened 5 years ago, whatever Daniel had tried to protect, it wasn't over. And now, neither were they.